Well, thank you, everybody. My name is Pedro Zepeda. I'm a citizen of the Seminole tribe of Florida. So it's one of two federally recognized tribes in the state. Can anybody name the other federally recognized tribe in the state?
Miccosukee tribe?
Yes, Miccosukee. Thank you. You don't count. I'm married to you. And so we have two federally recognized tribes in the state of Florida. I'll talk a little bit about that later. Difference between kind of like modern, federally recognized governmental entities versus like historic tribal towns and identity. I've really been, using this presentation a lot lately because I do get the question a lot like, well, who are the Seminoles? And then like I hear vastly different things on what people think Seminoles are, or some people have no idea and they want me to tell them. And so I usually have to ask them, how much time do you have? You want the 5-minute version or the 45-minute version? And it's still, people are still usually confused, but it's a good, being confused leads you to want to learn more though, So anyhow, we'll move on here. I'm doing the wrong thing, I'm supposed to point it at that. Okay, so what does the internet say who the Seminoles are? So this is from the Florida Department of State. Old Encyclopedia Britannica is online these days in the Museum of Florida History. So the Department of State says Creeks migrate to Florida. Seminole history begins with bands of Creek Indians from Georgia and Alabama who migrated to Florida in the 1700s. And then conflicts with Europeans and other tribes caused them to seek new places to live. So the Department of State says Seminoles are Creeks that moved to Florida, basically. Britannica says Seminole Creek origins speak a Muskogean language. Last half of the 18th century, migrants from Creek towns moved into Florida, former territory of Appalachia, Timucua. Migrants became known by the name Seminole. And then Museum of Florida History, ancestors of today's Seminole people migrated to Florida in the 1700s and early 1800s. Came primarily from Alabama and Georgia, simply known as Creeks by the British, spoke different languages and lived in independent towns. Different bands of Creeks established towns in North Florida and traded with both British and Spanish, and so on and so forth. And they were known as Seminoles eventually. So in the story I probably hear the most is Seminoles are just Creeks that moved into Florida. But the other one I hear is Seminoles are just a mixture of a bunch of different Indians and different peoples, and that's what they are. And neither one of those is right, but neither one of those is wrong either. It's like simplifying American history down to saying, oh, all Americans are just British people that moved from England. Or, oh, all Americans are just people that are just mixed from a whole bunch of different European nations. Neither one of those is wrong or right. History is much more nuanced than that. Part of how I like to break it down for people is by the language families that we spoke. So the Museum of Florida History did touch upon it in their short definition of who the Seminoles are. And so often people get these languages confused. What's the difference between Creek, Muskogee, Miccosukee, Seminole? And what doesn't make it any easier, sometimes these terms are used interchangeably as well. Or they might mean a different thing depending on what geographical location you're talking about. So that's just the part of the help confuse you guys part. But looking at this map, I know you can't read it. I actually can't read it, this resolution, but you can see all the different little language groups that are across the southeast. So obviously it's not just one single language. One of the larger language groups spoken in the southeast was and is the Muskogee Creek language. But it is not the same language that most Seminoles in Florida speak today. I'll talk a little bit more about the language here real quick. Too many. There we go. So in Florida today, the Seminole tribe of Florida and Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida, and then there's a third group, the independent Seminoles. So they're just as Seminole as the Miccosukee and Seminole tribe of Florida. They just never enrolled in either federally recognized tribe. And this only goes back to the 1950s, that history. And so the Seminole, independent Seminoles and Miccosukees predominantly speak the Miccosukee language. It is a different language than the Muskogee Creek language. So if Seminoles were just Creeks that moved to Florida, what language would you think that all the Florida Seminoles would speak today? Creek. But we don't. It's a minority language within the Seminole tribe today. So we do have a group of Seminoles that speak the Creek language, or they're from Creek-speaking families, but they are the minority within the Seminole tribe of Florida. That's, again, I think a lot of things that people don't realize. So it kind of like almost shoots the, out of the water, the idea that Seminoles are just Creeks that moved to Florida. And so all this goes on to the broader aspect of self-identity. And I think this is a really big point that I think a lot of scholars and people miss, is that the way Native Americans and Seminoles and Southeastern tribes self-identify is a very different worldview than Western cultures self-identify. So of course we all can identify by our own self, your own person, but that's kind of where it gets different from each culture around the world. And so the next thing I have here is clan. And so what has been and continues to be an important part of Seminole culture and other Southeastern tribes is our matrilineal clan system. So it's just a fancy way of saying we keep track of our families by inheriting our clan from our mother. So in Western culture, you generally keep track of family by inheriting your father's last name. But in honestly, most Native American cultures across North America, you inherit your mother's clan. And I hear the, Now imagine 250 years ago, people trying to, wrap their heads around this idea. Again, we've been on this continent for tens of thousands of years, and, many of you are just hearing this for the first time. So like I'm Panther Clan because my mother was Panther Clan, because her mother was Panther Clan, and going on and on all the way back to when we emerged from the earth. And so because of that, we also don't marry within our clan because that's considered your family. So you marry somebody from a different clan. And then those children will be the clan of whoever their mother is. So we identify by ourselves, we identify by our clan. And then next, we would identify by what town or city we came from. Okay? Notice I'm not saying like village or chiefdom or something like that, because that's kind of honestly antiquated use of like European terms to think of Native Americans as not being capable of having cities and towns and complex systems of living. So our towns and cities, that was your next kind of layer of identification. And the people in that town would generally speak the same language. Majority of the women would be of the same clan. Again, a little different than how we live today. And then sometimes we would associate by a larger tribe or nation. And usually that's only if it was out of necessity, like say there's a foreign invader. We're celebrating the 250th anniversary of the last one that came through here. And then these larger tribes and nations were often connected by language and culture, but again, every town wouldn't necessarily speak the same language. And you'd have many people who were multilingual in multiple Southeastern native languages as well. Okay? So this is everything I said, trying to make it, a little more written down. So you have like your maternal lineage and your paternal lineage. And so, again, tracking family through the mother's clan, but what else does that mean? Just other than it's how you track your family. It also extends to education, to medicine, to war. All these things are done by clan. So if you have someone that's Otter Clan man, and he marries a woman that's Panther Clan, the children will be Panther Clan, and then their formal education will be the responsibility of the mother's brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles that are of the same clan. And again, this doesn't mean the father doesn't play a role in raising the children, that the father doesn't ever teach their kids, but just like today, we tend to send our kids off to public schools to get their formal education. It doesn't mean the parents don't teach their kids anything. I mean, most do, hopefully, at least. And so yeah, and that matrilineal clan system was really important. And so when it came time to war, each of the clans has a certain role that they have to play. When it comes time for ceremony, each of the clans has different roles that they have to play in ceremony. So yeah, that matrilineal clan system was really vital. It's still important to a lot of these different things that we still continue to do today.
Can I ask a quick question? With the clans,
We'll see if it's a quick question.
how did the language between the clans, the women and the husbands work?
So I mean, the husband, just because he's a different clan doesn't necessarily mean he speaks a different language either. But it can. The father could speak, Creek, and the mother could speak Miccosukee, but obviously they had, one or both of them would have to be bilingual. And then again, with the children, they may learn both languages, but they will most definitely learn their mother's language. Okay, and then we still even see that today. Like I know child members that they have, parent that's from like our Brighton Creek speaking community, and their mother is Miccosukee speaking. And I know some that are bilingual in both, and some that only learn their mother's language. So, I'm going to go a little bit more into like the, colonial era of Florida here. This is not my area of big expertise, but I'm hoping that the little bit of explanation beforehand kind of helps with our, broader understanding of what was happening to, quote unquote, the Seminoles. Again, who we now know were originally from different tribal towns. Until, again, they're being pursued, and then they had to move off into smaller villages from that point forward, because towns and cities are much more easily attacked. So, in case anybody didn't know, Florida used to be separated like alphabet soup. No, I'm just kidding. But I believe this is a British colonial map from when England took hold of Florida for a short time. And so you can see the understanding of the map, this northern portion of what's today Florida, but back then was East and West Florida. And West Florida, actually, if I remember, I think this was Mobile Bay, and this is the Mississippi River here. So again, West Florida used to go all the way over to the Mississippi River there. And so, England had inherited quite a large chunk of land. And so, you kind of have the first Spanish colonial period from the early 1500s up until, I had to check the date in a minute, but thank you, 1763. I know it's like 1760s. Yes, my wife, I'm really bad with numbers. That's why she remembers all the dates for everything we have to do. And but so first Spanish colonial period, so it basically established St. Augustine and Pensacola. Again, it's somewhere in here actually. So obviously the map's not 100% to scale. And then they had a road from here. It's probably originally an Indian trail, and they established a bunch of missions along that trail. And by establishing missions, I mean they built a church in Indian towns and cities. And they actually, when they named them, they kept the names of a lot of those towns. They just put the name of a saint at the beginning of it. So it's like San something, Appalachia. So they had, and most of them tended to be concentrated up around the Tallahassee area, which will kind of be, it's kind of an interesting aspect as well. This goes a little bit more into the how long have Seminoles been in Florida. Because if you go by that, Seminoles are just creeks that moved into Florida, then it stands that, oh, Seminoles have only been in Florida for, 200 to 300 years. And it kind of makes it sound like we just poof, popped up out of nowhere, like we sprung up like spring daisies. But, in our own oral histories, we know we've been in Florida for a very, very long time. And we have some very old stories about the place that we live in today still. And so, yeah, and there's finally people kind of doing a little more research into, well, what happened to all these mission towns that seem to have eventually got abandoned? A lot of them just moved into the woods, again, because of encroachment. And so when, officials would come through like, oh, these towns are empty, I can send news back to the boss, oh, all the Indians are gone. And that's, for them, that was kind of like the easiest thing to like, oh, I pushed everything into the closet, the floor is clean, boss. And so we're going to find out that a lot of Seminole descendants are probably descendants of some of these former Appalachian towns that were around Tallahassee that had been there for who knows how long. Because we have stories of when like Florida looked like a savanna. How long ago would that have been? We have stories of Polynesians visiting, and then obviously you have to be coastal, not inland like the Muskogee Creeks were. We have stories about how the Kissimmee River was formed and how the Lake Okeechobee was formed. And so, again, if we'd only been in Florida for 200, 300 years, how would we know those stories? And so I think that's kind of part of the reason, I put this map up. I think it's just to kind of give a bit of a different geographical view of the cultural landscape at the time and how varied it was. Because we also always hear like, oh, the Spanish came and all the original Floridians died out. It makes it sound like Spanish arrived and, 1 year later everybody was gone. But that's not really what happened. Because you still have reports of a lot of these groups in the late 1700s, Timucua and Calusa and things like that were still around hundreds of years after the Spanish had arrived. Just a good majority of them, had given way to disease, but not everybody had. And they continued to live in Florida. And again, some of them did integrate with the Seminoles as well. What would become Seminole? Okay, I think this is where I have to try and do fancy stuff. And test my tech skills. So colonial Florida, there are very few European settlements and towns within the interior of Florida, And so again, it was just that St. Augustine and Pensacola were basically the main hubs. Here's the dates, because I couldn't remember them, so I had to put them down there. But so yeah, the first and second Spanish periods. And so the British period is between 1763 and 1783. Hopefully I have the dates right. And so you can see Spain had control of the Florida territory for 236 years, while U.S. has had control of Florida for 205 years. A lot of people don't realize that Spain still has technically owned Florida longer than the United States has. So we still have a few more years before we've outgrown Spain and the ownership of Florida. But again, this is for the native people here, it's all kind of a game of chess. Obviously for us, it's just like, well, we lived here, we should just, be the place that we've always been. We should be able just to continue to live. But for the Europeans, they're like, no, you guys can't be there. We need that land. Although it's interesting in the kind of towards the end of that second Spanish colonial period, Spain definitely actually liked having Seminoles in Florida. I'll get into that here in a second. So, how many of you actually heard of the Patriot War of 1812? I don't know you. Okay, there are a few of you. And it's kind of a little known era in the history of Florida, but it's actually a very important era in the history of Florida and eventually the Seminole Wars and eventually U.S. history, and also kind of gets wrapped up into world history as well. The Patriot War, so again, going back to East and West Florida, and so the U.S. had, expanded their territory, and so there's, not everyone agreed on what actually was West Florida, what was actually U.S. territory, what was Spanish territory. Of course, the U.S. wants to say, well, it's all ours. And Spain's like, no, not all of it is yours. So they started making encroachments into West Florida, but, there are certain Georgians that thought, well, we should just take East Florida, because everyone kind of knew Spain was kind of a waning kingdom at the time. There's really not that many people left in St. Augustine or Pensacola, especially militarily in those places. So the U.S. definitely knew this. And they knew it probably wouldn't be very long before they would have a chance to take Florida either through negotiation or by force from the Spanish. But there's something else that was also happening at 1812. Does anybody know what?
The British or the French went into Russia.
Then it's the War of 1812, and that the U.S. was also preparing to fight, getting ready to fight again at the time, the largest military force on the planet. And so these Georgians, but they're like, oh, but we want Florida too at the same time. And so they did a military filibuster. It's different than a political one, which basically means just a group of guys get together to form a militia, and we're like, okay, we're going to operate as our own army, independent of any country. And so this was led by Matthews, a former Georgia governor, actually. And so he gathered these men, and the idea was supposed to be that the people that were living in Florida were going to be so inspired that they would take up arms and help them throw over St. Augustine. And so some people did, take up arms, and they actually managed to take over Fernandina. And so they're like, okay, well, we're on a roll here. But they also knew the Seminoles were living in Florida, and the Spanish knew that this was happening by this point as well. So they both sent couriers to Painstown, near Gainesville, to King Payne, and basically to say, the Americans were saying, don't pay attention to what's happening here with the Spanish. Everything's going to be fine. We're going to take it over, and you guys will be okay. The Spanish send word, they're like, hey, the Americans are attacking us. Can you help us keep them at bay? And we'll continue to honor your, land and hunting and grazing rights that you've had, under Spanish rule. So life under Spanish rule for Seminoles was pretty good at the time. And so who do you think they trusted more?
Spanish.
The Spanish. And so they ended up helping the Spanish defend eventually. And so in that, army of patriots, as they called them, tried to march onto St. Augustine, they were encountered by a group of free black militia, and they were basically defeated. And so many of these militia were, dressed in, native type clothes, because some of them probably just take up the style of the Seminoles. Some of them live side by side with Seminoles at different points. And so they're defeated, and so I'm trying to remember his name. I told Jeremy, I was like, I'm trying to remember all these names and dates in my head. But yeah, one of the lieutenants, he did not like that they're defeated, and because they got beat by this group of free black militia, so he said, so we're going to attack Painstown, because they were dressed like Indians. So we're going to go attack the Indians.
That was the guy they named it.
Noonan, thank you. I was trying to remember my mnemonic. I was like Noonan's Lake. I don't know if he's named after that one or not, but
Yes.
it is this, is the same reason? Okay. And so he went to go attack the Seminoles. Well, that didn't really go so well for him either, and he got defeated over there by the Seminoles. So he got to get defeated twice in Florida. So he has that great honor. And the U.S. was kind of keeping an eye on it, but kind of not really wanting to get involved in it either, because they didn't want to be so extroverted in, supporting this military action into Spain to kind of stir up the hornet's nest, while they're also trying to, prepare action against Britain at the time. And so the whole thing just kind of fizzled apart. So there was no, patriot nation, I guess, that was formed in Florida. And I think the idea was for them to then relinquish their patriot lands to the United States once they acted independently. So this is kind of early on conflicts with the Seminoles with their kind of first encounter with quote unquote U.S. forces. Because a lot of these were Georgia militia, is who allowed, I think about 70% of the men that went into Florida were Georgia militia. And so only the remainder were the 30% or so were the Floridians that felt like they wanted to be patriotic too. So you can see in these, in the second decade of Florida history, there's a lot of stuff. There's definitely a lot more things I could add to this list too. You could write books about each of the things, and there literally are books written about each of these things. So you have attack on Foultown in November of 1817, and then coincidentally, a little over a week later, you have the Scott Battle on the Apalachicola River, originally called the Scott Massacre, but again, history written by the winners. It was an attack on a military boat in the Apalachicola River, had about 40 armed soldiers on board with artillery on the boat. So it wasn't exactly a massacre, so to speak, in unarmed men, but in the sense of that most of the people on board were killed. There were a few survivors that managed to swim to shore, and there was a single female that was taken prisoner by the Seminoles, who was later actually found and I guess reintegrated into Western culture. So you have this attack on our town of Apalachicola, and then kind of what a lot of people say is like the beginning of the first Seminole War. It's kind of Jackson's campaign through Florida. He attacked and burned several villages and towns along the way, but the largest was Miccosukee, which is on Lake Miccosukee near present-day Tallahassee. And Tallahassee was also a site where we were at, and there's also Lake Seminole. Again, why are these things called Lake Seminole, Lake Miccosukee? Because we've been here for a while. And thankfully for at Miccosukee, we had, gotten word that Jackson was coming to basically, raise the land. So most of the women and children managed to flee, and a group of about 500 warriors stayed behind to basically try and, hold back the military as long as they could to give everyone else as much of a head start as possible. So being able to muster 500 warriors, shows you, how big Miccosukee was. I mean, some people call it several towns, but I think it's basically just settlement around the lake, mostly on the western side of the lake. Today there's not really much evidence that there was a large Seminole town there that had been there for generations. And then in one day, the whole thing was burned down. So this is getting towards the end of us having Seminole towns and Seminole villages. So, is there any quick questions about this period? Again, it's not my area of huge expertise, but I do know a little bit, or at least a little bit about Seminole culture as far as it reflects on this time period. Of course, this leads into the Seminole Wars, but I think probably, almost beat that horse to death, I guess, probably, about speaking about the Seminole Wars. But again, just, how early these conflicts started, which started basically as border conflicts that eventually leads into full-on war. With the quote-unquote ending of the Seminole Wars in the 1850s, we basically fought the U.S. government for over 40 years. And so even for us today, we don't call it, the First Seminole War, Second Seminole War, Third Seminole War. For us, it was one war, because we didn't have the luxury of leaving after our tour of duty. So for an entire generation, people grew up basically under the constant, fear and threat of removal, or being killed or being hunted. And honestly, this did go back and forth a lot on the frontier. Again, when it was the Seminoles doing the attacking, it was a massacre. When it was the U.S., it was retribution for the massacres. Because that Scott battle, because there were women and children on board that boat that were killed, that was basically used as an excuse to send Jackson into Florida to burn down Miccosukee. But again, you can see there had already been attacks on Seminoles as well. So again, it wasn't, nobody was necessarily innocent, but everybody was angry, and it was a very violent and turbulent time to live in the southern U.S. Again, it wasn't just concentrated to, this part of Florida, as you see it stretch into Georgia and Alabama and beyond, really. Because it's just basically two groups that were at ends, with the Native people just wanting to live where they would live, but the U.S. saying, no, it's ours now, you have to leave. There are groups of natives in the Southeast that tried to integrate into, Western culture in various ways, and it worked to various extents. Sometimes it worked for a time, and then sometimes it suddenly didn't work anymore. Like even the Cherokees went to the Supreme Court and won their right to stay on their original homelands in northern Georgia. As Jackson told the Supreme Court justice to let him enforce it. And he kicked them out anyways. Because we hear of the Trail of Tears, very often associated with the Cherokees, and they certainly had the largest amount of people that were relocated, but it was also Seminoles and Muskogee Creeks and Choctaws, and Uchis, and so there's all these southeastern groups are being moved to Indian Territory, or it's today Oklahoma. So that's kind of, I guess, a succinct history of the colonial Florida, I guess, and a little bit about the identity of these people. So when you say Seminole, especially in these historic times, it's not necessarily a completely cohesive group. But for the U.S., it was easier just to say, everybody in Florida is Seminole. It doesn't matter if they speak Yuchi, if they speak Miccosukee, if they speak Muskogee Creek. I think even a few Choctaws made it into Florida. But for the U.S., they're all Seminoles. So if we speak to one group, then we can say, hey, they've signed for everybody else. When again, it's like, if someone across town, signs to sell their house, and somebody comes and says, hey, your house is part of that now. And you're like, well, I didn't sign anything. It's like, well, they live kind of close to you, so yes, this all counts. So U.S. law and order.
Yeah.
I think you had a question, maybe.
This is a little bit before
Yeah.
that. I just wondered, the mission eras, did they come down the Ocklawaha? Were there missions along the Ocklawaha?
I am not sure.
Yes, lots.
Thank you, Jeremy.
I read that they were looking for some. I just didn't know if, they were looking for sites.
They followed the main rivers down through. So it was the Kings Road from St. Lawrence stream, the Pensacola, and then they followed the Ocklawaha, they followed the St. John's.
So they didn't get pushed to the south. They were already.
So as far as like Seminoles, again, we're very acquainted with all Florida. I like to say that, you know, some original Seminole homelands is the southeastern tri-state area of North Florida, Georgia, Alabama, that area.
So North Florida. not-
But again, we're still definitely very familiar with the entire
Yeah.
state. You know, because we definitely make, you know, lots of hunting trips down into the southern part of Florida, do trading in southern part of Florida. We would war in southern Florida. You know, and, you know, it's kind of crazy to think of a group of about 5,000 people fighting the U.S. government for over 40 years.
Right.
You know, and just in the period that they call the Second Seminole War, the U.S. government sent around 50,000 U.S. troops to Florida to remove around 5,000 Seminoles. And we still managed to be here today. You know, and eventually, you know, towards the end of, you know, that height of conflict, the U.S. finally did start, resorting to fighting like we fought. And then, you know, using false pretenses to get people to come in and to, you know, arrest them and ship them off.
Sounds like you're following the same playbook.
I mean, history repeats itself. But like, if you haven't been to Luxahatchee, to the battlefield site there, it's a great place to visit. It looks like a beautiful, peaceful place now, but it definitely has its, you know, violent history there as well. It was like doing archaeology on site. You know, of course, they find like, you know, handcuffs and shackles, both in adult and children's size. Question back there.
I was just wondering, since you alluded to mythology or the origin story of Lake Okeechobee, was there an origin story for the people that were here prior to being invaded by colonists? What was their...
I mean, for us, the origin story is that we emerged from the backbone of the earth.
Okay, it didn't have anything to do with Polynesia.
No, not the origin story. We just know that they came and visited, but a bunch of our different groups were kind of fighting at that time, so they didn't really hang around for very long and left. You know, so, but, you know, but they said we do have a little bit of knowledge of that happening with the Polynesians, but again, our origin story basically is just that we emerged from underneath the earth by clan.
Interesting, because I know that there's a spine in Florida that has ancient indigenous flora and fauna that doesn't exist anywhere else on Earth. That's like back to dinosaur time.
Yeah, and I think for us, I mean, I think heard some of our elders say they think it might be the Appalachian mountain chain possibly was the backbone for us. You know, it's funny because like, I don't know, it's funny, but interesting. I was watching a show, I think on, I think it was like on Chaco Canyon out west, and they're talking to some natives out there, and they have the same origin story. You know, thousands of miles away. So I'll get a little bit into modern history because people are always interested in, you know, how do we go from, you know, our cities and towns to, you know, conflict to being, you know, the Seminole, Miccosukee, and independent Seminoles we are today, and Oklahoma Seminoles as well. You know, so you'll notice for Florida, we're the Seminole tribe of Florida, and Oklahoma, the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. So when referring to us, at least in modern times, you know, a lot of people say, oh, Pedro from the Seminole Nation. Well, for us, you know, I'm the Seminole tribe. Seminole Nation refers to the Oklahoma Seminoles today, again. But this really only goes back to, again, the 1950s. The U.S. had what they call the Indian Termination Act. And so they no longer meant physical termination, they meant sovereign termination. So they said basically any tribe, nation, pueblo, band that didn't formally organize with a written constitution and bylaws would no longer be recognized as a sovereign nation by the United States government. So in the 1950s, 1960s, and into the early 1970s is when you see the formation of the federally recognized tribes that we have today. So, and you know, it's a designation. Doesn't mean that we weren't native before we had federal recognized status. You know, again, that's how we ended up with independent Seminoles. There's still a few today of. So these are kind of our numbers today. You know, we're almost back to our original numbers in Florida. I mean, we kind of really are if you include Seminole and Miccosukee together. And independent, so we're just over 5,000 people. So 4,300 enrolled Seminole Tribe of Florida, around 700 Miccosukee. Independent Seminoles, I would say there's probably only about maybe 30 or so that are independent Seminoles still. You know, most either gotten older and passed away, or they've joined either Seminole or Miccosukee tribe over the years. So like, for example, my family were independent Seminoles up until the 1980s. And then some of our family joined Seminole tribe of Florida, some of them joined the Miccosukee tribe of Florida. So I go to the other question, well, what's the difference between Seminole and Miccosukee? It goes back to the Indian Termination Act. So it is a bureaucratic difference, not a long-standing cultural historical difference. So how many of you tried to go out to dinner with a large group of friends before? How easy is it to pick a single place to eat? Now imagine trying to make an entire government with those same people. Not everyone's going to agree on how that government should be formed. So in 1957, the Seminole Tribe of Florida formed. But there was a group who became the Miccosukee that didn't like the way that the Seminole Tribe of Florida was formed. And so they wanted to form their own tribe. But of course the U.S. government told them, no, you guys are the same people as the Seminoles, just join the Seminole tribe if that's what you want to do. So in 1960s Florida, how many of you were in Florida in the 1960s? Okay, so this will hit a little harder with y'all, I think. 1960s Florida, what the Miccosukee tribe does is they send their leadership to Cuba to meet with Fidel Castro during the 1960s in Florida.
Oh boy.
And so, yeah, so it was a little bit of a, spicy time between Cuba and the U.S. and, communism at large at the time. And so they met with Fidel Castro to try and gain recognition from Cuba as a sovereign nation. And so as soon as they landed, I think back in Miami, guess who was there to greet the returning delegation of Miccosukees, representatives from the U.S. government? And basically say, hold on, okay, you guys can have your own tribe, but please do not go back and meet with Fidel Castro again. And so in 1962, the Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida, they picked a very long name for some reason, but that is the official name of the Miccosukee tribe today. And then, again, the third group, Independent Seminoles, basically the idea was just, well, we don't need the U.S. government to tell us who we are, and we're just going to keep on doing what we've always done. Again, it has its advantages and disadvantages to not being recognized as a sovereign nation by the, larger country that we unfortunately now lived in. And so again, like I said, my family were Independent Seminoles. My grandpa Corey was leader of the Independent Seminoles. And so he's kind of one of our last traditional chiefs, quote unquote. And so, once he passed away in the late 70s, I think it was like 79, it was after that a lot of our, at least my branch of the family, started joining either Seminole or Miccosukee tribe. But again, they said there are some that didn't join either.
A ceremony? Is there a ceremony to join? Like
It's called being born.
I mean, you just say, hey, I want to be.
Well, again, these are modern governmental entities.
Yeah.
So there is an enrollment process. So even if you have a child, they have to be enrolled. For a while, both tribes did allow people to kind of jump ship, but it's probably around, I don't know, maybe around 15 years ago, both tribes are like, no, we're stopping. If you guys are Seminole, you're staying Seminole, and your families are going to be Seminole. If you're Miccosukee, you're staying Miccosukee, and your kids will all be Miccosukee. And so, like, you know, like my aunt is Miccosukee, but she enrolled her daughter in the Seminole tribe of Florida. And she did that because at the time, the Seminole tribe of Florida had better educational benefits. And thankfully those were still there as she went to college and stuff like that. So not really a ceremony, it's just forms. It's nothing terribly exciting.
Can I ask one more question? So, it's kind of like an amalgam of all these tribes that came together here in Florida. And the outsiders, the U.S. government said, we're calling you Seminoles. But they were all different. Creek and, you know, Miccosukee or whoever. What, did they have a name for themselves
So, here, let me,
other than Seminole?
yeah, because I think you missed the beginning, correct?
You got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fine. I just want to, I'll just pull this back up a little bit here, but this is what you have to try and memorize before you leave. But,
I saw that.
okay.
It was the first slide or two.
Yeah. But as far as what we call ourselves, I mean, a lot of times, you know, it was just a word for people, you know. But a lot of times the names we came were by what other people called us. Because, you know, you're like, you know, it's like going to a picnic for your wife's friends, and you go to your wife, like, hey, what's her name? You know? And so that's kind of what, you know, the French and the Spanish and the English did. They're like, hey, what are those people on the other side of the river called? It's like Appalachia literally means on the other side. The other people, or something along those lines. Like, I mean, like in Miccosukee, Aparonte just means the other side. So Appalachia, because Appalachia was another Muskogean language. But, you know, so there's probably definitely things that we had called ourselves a long time ago, but again, these names have kind of stuck. And so, like, even the name Seminole, we always hear, oh, Seminole just comes from the Spanish word cimarron. But where does the Spanish word cimarron come from? Nobody ever asks that. That word is not used until Spanish are in North America. And it's actually used, what I was seeing is like early, like in the, like in Cuba and the Caribbean, because that's what those people were calling like animals that were living out in the woods, or people that had were escaped and were living in the woods. That's what those people were. They were using that word Seminole, Cimarroni, and then the Spanish, right, is cimarron. Well, then the Spanish go across all of North America and they carry that word with them. So, oh, these horses in the west, they're cimarrons. Oh, these people living out there, they're cimarrons. Oh, the people in Florida, they're cimarrons. So, again, there's that. Nobody really takes that extra step to like, well, where did the Spanish get that word? Because it isn't used before they're in North America.
I have a question.
Yes.
You said your grandfather was a tribal chief. Was he on your mom's side or your dad's side?
On my mom's side. So it's my maternal grandmother's father.
Okay.
So my mom's mom, it's her dad.
So it was the
Great-grandfather.
So it was the clan that went.
So he was big town, I believe, but his wife was Panther because my grandma was Panther and her mom's Panther.
So you're okay. So I got it.
Okay, yeah, I guess I answered the question.
No, I got it.
Yeah. So hopefully, I don't know if I answered your question fully.
I appreciate it.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't mean to throw you off.
Oh, no, you're fine. You're fine. I was really kind of wrapped up with the presentation for the most part here. And so the last one I left off was the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma. So, of course, these are the Seminoles that were removed from Florida during that Seminole War time period. Majority during, again, what history calls the Second Seminole War. and were moved to Indian Territory where they still live today. And today they have about 18,800 enrolled citizens. So the numbers here and here kind of tell you how many Seminoles were removed from Florida. So the majority of Seminoles were relocated from Florida, but the ones that stayed, a majority of them happen to be the ones that had been in Florida for a very long time, the Miccosukee-speaking Seminoles. I've heard estimates from 300 to 700 Seminoles were left after the wars. It is hard to count people that are trying to hide. So I always say it's probably in the 500, I'd guess, right in the middle of the low and the high, but, nobody really knows exactly how many were left. But, because even around the turn of the century, I think there were still only around 700 or so Seminoles at the time, when it was a little bit easier to figure out how many Seminoles were around. Being at war with a country for that long really leaves an imprint on the people as well. Because it sounds weird, but it does still affect us today in how we conduct ourselves and the stories that we do and the things that we learn. But we were able to, hold off the U.S. for so long. Part of it's just because military culture is already built into our culture. So when you hear the names of Seminole leaders, it's not just like a name. Most of those are titles or a title with an additional name. So if you hear something that's like Tustanuggy, Tusco Samahla, Tuska, that Tuska means it's a military title of some sort. And if you hear Miko, that means they're a high leader, a lead leader. So like Miko Nopi, Mikanope. So again, most of those names you're hearing are some type of military title that they received when they were young. And so again, when you go to war, you already know what your rank and place is when it's time to go to battle.
Is that also the name, I don't know if I'm saying it right, Kajaho?
Oh, Kuihajo. Kui is like a panther or a cat.
I know the little area above Silver Springs is, I still can't say it. How do you say it? Kohajo.
It's Kuihajo.
Oh, I like a better way to say it.
But people say Kohajo, but Kui.
Yeah, I just wondered if that was a military thing or.
I'm trying to remember what Hajo is supposed to mean, but I know you see it a lot in the names of the leaders for sure. But yeah, so it's funny, being in our age of social media, it's funny when people are like, oh, try to say these Florida towns, and they ask British people or whatever, and they're mangling them up. But a lot of people don't realize the English-speaking Floridians are also mangling up the names. Because it's not Koehajo, it's Koehajo. It's not Okeechobee, it's Okeechobee. It's not Micanopy, Micanope. It's not Immokalee, it's Immokalee. So it's.
I like the way you say that.
What's the other one? There's all these, and then some of these names are Miccosukee, some of them are in Muskogee Creek too. So it depends on where it is.
I see up there the Hichiti tribe, or...
Oh, Muskogee Hitchiti. I think Jake says it Hidgety. But it's probably got a Creek accent on it, to be honest. But anyhow, I digress. So Hitchiti is a close relative to the Miccosukee language. So again, here in Florida after the wars, majority are Miccosukee speaking people with a minority of Muskogee Creek speakers. In Oklahoma, they ended up with a majority of Muskogee Creek speaking Seminoles with a minority of Miccosukee / Hitchiti speaking people.
Thank you.
So, and then, like I said, it's very, a layered process. And in Oklahoma, at least a lot of them still know what original town they came from too. and especially like the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma, they still, even though it's a modern government, they still have representatives from their original towns in their modern government. So it's kind of having like district representatives kind of. So in Florida, we do have representatives from our different reservations, but that's not like our original towns. But so we have representatives from, Big Cypress, Brighton, and Hollywood. I like to end on, how to be an advocate for Seminoles today. Because again, that's the part a lot of people leave off. Because again, a lot of people, people that are familiar with, Florida history or are familiar with Seminoles, a lot of times their knowledge ends at the 1850s. And they have no idea what we've been doing since then. So we try to have relations with historic sites. A lot of historic sites, thankfully, today are trying to, seek active relations with the Seminole tribe of Florida and the Miccosukee tribe of Florida. Miccosukee tribe of Indians of Florida. I said they have a long name. And through historic interpretation of sites and, allowing Seminoles to have input on that interpretation. Because I do get a lot of requests. I try to answer as much stuff as I can. But I'm just one person. And but we do have a museum that thankfully has a great and growing young staff of Seminoles that are becoming very interested. So that's the great thing about the younger ones. There tends to be more of them over the years. When we started with such a small group. The Seminole Tribes Museum is called the Atatigi Museum, but if you just type in Seminole Museum, you'll find it online. It's on the Big Cypress Reservation. Big Cypress Reservation, not to be confused with Big Cypress National Preserve, because they're about like 30 miles apart as the crow flies. So don't go to one or the other. Even though they're 30 miles apart, it'll take you about like an hour and change to get from one to the other, because there's not many roads.